ground between Glendale and Malvern Hill, and he says it is a horrible sight to walk over the ground so hotly contested for. The dead are buried promiscuously over the field, or rather covered up, not even buried. Numerous were the graves where I could see 4 or 5 skulls in one hole. Also feet, legs, arms, and hands sticking out. The dead Confederates are also buried promiscuously, but their graves are rounded up and mostly marked, while ours are just level with the ground. From what I have seen, I come to the conclusion that they buried our men more to prevent the stench than from humanity's sake. Although I may be mistaken, as a person's body would soon smell so that it is almost impossible to handle them, and therefore would have to be covered up wherever they fell. So again, we have Federal soldiers kind of wondering, well, why aren't our dead being treated with respect? Why are our dead left out here festering? Isn't for humanity's sake? Shouldn't they be covered up just like the Confederate dead? It's a problem for them too. There's a woman who lives in downtown Richmond who comes out to the battlefields in the fall of 1862. Her name is Mrs. Emma Wood Richardson, and she is also disgusted by what she comes across. She says it was only a few days after the battles around Richmond, while the ambulances were still hauling dead Confederates to Richmond, that we passed Malvern Hill. On the side of the road, we could see portions of human bodies protruding when they had been so hurriedly buried that the earth did not entirely cover them. And at the Haxall's house, or in an outhouse there, we saw portions of the human body lying. To pass over such a field of carnage is perhaps permitted to few women in a lifetime. I would not for worlds pass through them again, yet the memory of those scenes has formed a sad chapter in my life. The forest trees on every side were torn, the limbs and bark hanging, dead horses lying in the intense heat of the sun, and shallow mounds dotted the forests. We knew that each one covered somebody's loved one, and that perhaps their resting place would forever remain unknown. So here's this Confederate woman deeply troubled by these bodies, Federal and Confederate, being left out there, unmarked, unknown, left out in the middle of the sun. But it's not just this physical and moral revulsion that people feel toward what they see left on the battlefield. To really understand how shocked these people are by what they see in the aftermath of the battles, you kind of have to understand how Victorian people think. The average Victorian American is a staunch believer in what is commonly referred to as the good death. It is the death where you send a soldier or a loved one off to die for an honorable cause. They're able to come back and die at home, ultimately surrounded by loved ones, surrounded by friends who will comfort the individual into death. And that person can ultimately be given a full, proper Christian burial in a restful, quiet, solemn place where the family and friends can come visit. Now this is the ideal. This is what Victorians want. This is what they need to ease their peace of mind. It's an image that looks very much like this. And this is a painting actually called The Good Death. This is what they want to see their loved ones experiencing when they finally do pass on, surrounded by family and friends, by mourning women, by comforting family. Are they going to get that kind of burial, that kind of death, here out on your average Civil War battlefield? I don't think so. You guys are probably very familiar with some of the graphic images that pop up of Civil War battlefields of the dead that are sighted just years after the battle. It looks something like this. You see the skulls, you see the remains of tattered clothing, protruding, as I said, promiscuously from the ground. This doesn't look anything like their conception of the good death. And how do you reckon? How do you reconcile this in your mind? You're sending these men to die by the thousands and hundreds of thousands, and they can't even die that good death that is so important. Very important. Now soldiers, of course, Federal soldiers are going to see the remains of their friends, of comrades, perhaps of family, who have fallen on some of these battlefields in Virginia when they return the next year or perhaps 2 years down the road to fight in the same locations in Virginia. It's a shock to them, and it's also going to be a moment of paranoia for them. What if I end up like my uncle? What if I end up like this poor Federal soldier who's just lying out here, an arm here, a skull there, a leg there? I don't want to be part part of this war anymore. People are afraid, the soldiers will start saying. How are you going to keep recruiting men, feeding them into this cause? A man in the 1st New York Cavalry says that he came back to Malvern Hill after the battle, and he says, as I walked over the field and recognized positions, incidents of the battle came back to me. Early in the fight, a wounded man had retired a short distance to the rear. To examine his wound, his clothing had been partly removed. He was lying on his side. From the middle of his back, the blood was slowly flowing. He had been shot through the middle of the body, and his case was hopeless. As the contending masses surged away to the left, the poor fellow was left unattended there in the dusty ground, under the hot sun, waiting helpless in his long agony. The darkness of death was slowly coming over his fluttering senses. How many 100,000 times was that speechless suffering to be multiplied during the years that were to come? So this man, remembering very keenly this episode of this man dying a horrible death on the battlefield next to him. There's also Confederates who come back to the same field, and they are doing and making comments that the Federals have always feared. Federals are afraid that their dead left out in the battlefield will be destroyed, will be dishonored by Confederates, by civilians, by Confederate soldiers. And one member of Hampton's Legion actually remarks kind of wryly about the Federal remains that he finds in the battlefield at Malvern Hill, that the camping ground we now occupy is literally covered with bones bleaching in the warmth of the summer sun. Our men were all around, and clinging to the skeletons we found around us are fragments of blue cloth, indicating that they are the detested foe. In their cries of "On to Richmond!" how many of these wretches have been hurled into eternity? God grant the enemy may soon see how utterly useless it is to attempt our subjugation, and soon listen to common sense and reason. He goes on to remark that he sees so many different pairs of skulls and jawbones and teeth lying everywhere. He says a dentist might make a valuable collection of these teeth. I have seen one beautiful set. Of course, a lot of these comments are just in jest to kind of get out some of their resentment toward the Federals. The Federals hear of these comments and they're afraid, again, their dead are going to be dishonored. They need a solution. They need a national solution, a political solution to this mess. A way to go out and retrieve those dead, to tell people, to reaffirm for people back at home that it's okay. That yes, we still need you to fight on the battlefields, and yes, if you die, you will be honored, you will be remembered, and properly. And that is where we get the origins of the National Cemetery System. Now we're going to move up toward the Flagpole Bastion, get kind of a central look of this cemetery, and talk about how that system comes into place and what happens here at Glendale as a result.